Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming to this breakout session. If there's any questions that come up, feel free, like I said, to put them in the chat box. I'll try to stop throughout so we can get all of your questions answered. I could also provide any contact information at the end of the session if people have further questions and need to get a hold of me. But I really appreciate you guys having me here. I think this topic, moral injury, is a very, very important topic, and I've been with the VA. This will be like my 5th year. I've been in Prescott for almost 2 years now, but previously worked at the Memphis VA and then also the VA in North Chicago, which is right next to Great Lakes Naval Base there. And I became interested in the topic of moral injury. Actually, I was working on the residential PTSD program at that North Chicago VA, and was working with an Afghanistan veteran who, as we got into his treatment, it became clear that there was some different types of trauma he had experienced and different types of symptoms that the treatment we were doing wasn't quite addressing. And I think that was at the moment that is my first year in the VA, and I kind of realized I'm not well enough equipped to help him. I don't know enough about this topic. So it's kind of been a passion of mine since then to make sure that I'm well versed and can help anybody who may be going through these things. So I appreciate you guys all here to learn a little bit more about it. We can go to the next slide. So our goal for today is just to talk about the different types of trauma that people can experience with a specific focus on moral injury and what that concept means, how it's similar and different from post-traumatic stress, and then also to go over some of the prevalence, common comorbidities, or different mental health concerns that co-occur with moral injury often, and then also to provide just a general overview of treatment options, and then to have some questions and discussion as well. Thank you. So I always, think of post-traumatic stress disorder when it was initially identified as a mental health concern in the diagnostic manual number 3. We're on number 5 right now. Basically, it was really very much considered an anxiety disorder. It was even under the realm of anxiety disorders for many, many years. That really had this focus on what we call life threat trauma. Right, so these are things when their life is in danger, and it can lead to these anxiety responses. And that's, for many, many people, that is the case, that can lead to these post-trauma symptoms. But what we started realizing over time is, especially in our service members, especially in veterans, combat veterans, that life threat type trauma is very prevalent, but is not the only thing that individuals are experiencing. And what we started realizing as well is that past that anxiety, there's a whole lot of other reactions that people are having in response to their combat-related trauma. And so this life threat trauma, again, is still very prevalent, but that's related more to when individuals have this sense of anxiety, fear, helplessness, panic, have this reaction of anxiety and stress. And then when we're focusing on treatment, what we're trying to do is really trying to build this sense of safety and mastery and confidence of that even though these things happened, I can go out in the world and I can handle this and I can keep myself safe. And that's kind of traditional PTSD diagnostic criteria as well as treatments. We're really focused on this anxiety piece of it. And what research is seeming over time is that there is also these other things, including traumatic loss and moral injury, which is the focus for today, that are really important concepts, but that need to be looked at by mental health and the community in a different way. And so for traumatic loss, again, that reaction can be sadness, numbness, rage, shock, and anguish that can lead to withdrawal, guilt, and feeling haunted. And a lot of times in treatment, we're focusing on trying to help people get reconnected and re-engaged with their family, friends, and community. And then with moral injury, a lot of times kind of the initial reaction are these feelings of guilt, shame, and rage. And then a lot of people report feeling unforgiven or having these self-handicapping behaviors or self-condemnation, which is thoughts like, I'm unforgivable or I'm not a good person. And so through treatment, what we're trying to focus a lot is on this forgiveness or compassion. And if you could go to the next slide, there's just a couple examples when we're thinking of what are these types of trauma. And so again, for that life threat, these are just some examples. Incoming small arms fire, exposure to improvised explosive devices, a motor vehicle accident, natural disasters, physical assault, sexual assault, all of those things are what we'd associate with that life threat. Somebody's doing harm or threatening you. With loss, it could be something witnessing the death of a friend or a fellow service member, learning about the details of that, Some examples of that moral injury that are very common. These are things just from research and also from experience that I've had working with veterans. Often these are some of the common, but definitely not an exhaustive list of potentially morally injurious events. So things such as witnessing or being involved in a civilian casualty, feeling betrayed by your peers or authority figures, giving orders that result in injury or death of a fellow service member, or failing to provide medical aid to an injured civilian. Next slide, please. All right, so I wanted to just briefly go over the criteria, kind of what we're thinking about when we're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, just because this will help us when we're comparing moral injury to PTSD to have an idea of what I'm talking about here. So when we think of post-traumatic stress disorder, what that means is it's a mental health concern that some people develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. And for post-traumatic stress, there are 4 types of symptoms, 4 categories of symptoms that we typically see. And the first one is re-experiencing symptoms. So that can include things like having intrusive memories, having nightmares, flashbacks, having strong physical or emotional reactions to trauma-related cues. Avoidance can be avoiding internal or external things that remind you of trauma or make you feel anxious and uncomfortable. So things like avoiding memories and thoughts or people, places, situations. Negative changes in beliefs and feelings. Sometimes people report trouble remembering aspects of their trauma. They can have negative thoughts about themselves, other people in the world. They can have self-blame, feelings of guilt, shame, fear, and anger, detachment from their loved ones, and feeling really disconnected from the things that they previously enjoyed. And then hyperarousal symptoms include things like hypervigilance, being really on edge, exaggerated startle response, so feeling really jumpy and nervous, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping, and anger and irritability. So the thing that's really important with PTSD to remember is there's all these different symptoms that somebody might be experiencing, but it's really unique and different for every person, right? So you might have 20 folks with this diagnosis coming into an office, and everybody's experience and what it means to them looks a little bit different because there's a whole range of symptoms that folks might be experiencing. Next slide. All right, so it's a little bit less clear when we think of what is moral injury and trying to define that construct. Because with post-traumatic stress disorder, that is a diagnosable disorder that they call it. It's basically a reaction to trauma that they have done a lot of research on. And moral injury is definitely not a new concept. They've written about the moral impact of combat and war for forever, right? Since there was written documents. It's been on and on and on for years. However, in terms of the mental health field and VA providers and research within mental health trying to figure out how to help people with this and really increase awareness of it, it is relatively new. And so really the term moral injury was coined by Dr. Jonathan Shea, who's a psychiatrist. He wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, looking at the impact of war on Vietnam veterans. And what he defined moral injury as a betrayal of what is right in a high stakes situation by somebody in legitimate authority. So he really had this focus on you're in these traumatic situations and the people around you are acting in such a way that you feel betrayed, that are not in line with your values, especially somebody that's in authority to you. Then we fast forward quite a bit of time as they started doing more research on this with post 9/11 era veterans. And Litz and colleagues, they created a treatment that we'll talk about a little bit later called adaptive disclosure. And what they described it as was the lasting emotional, psychological, social, behavioral, and spiritual impact of actions that violate a service member's moral values and behavioral expectations of self and others, right? So they really shifted it to be some of these symptoms associated with these, again, potentially morally injurious events if they really violate somebody's morals or values. And then this next one, the Jinkerson, we'll talk about that on another slide, but basically they actually proposed a symptomatic definition of moral injury, similar to how we have the different symptoms of PTSD. And then the National Center for PTSD defines moral injury as a mental health concern that occurs when people perpetrate, fail to prevent, or witness events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs or expectations. So similar to Litz. And then Courier and colleagues, they just released a book this year. So this is kind of the most recent, it's a whole compilation of research. And what the most recent definition is a construct that attempts to capture the constellation of inappropriate guilt, shame, anger, self-handicapping behaviors, relational, spiritual, social problems that emerge after witnessing or participating in war zone events that challenge one's sense of humanity. So we can kind of see that these definitions have changed over time with some similar underlying themes, but it's not something that there is that like very specific identifiable definition, at least at this point. It kind of keeps changing depending who you ask and which researchers you look at, which can make a lot of the research and treatment options and things difficult as we're trying to figure out what are we actually looking at. You go to the next slide. Is there any questions so far?
Dr. Sickler, I don't see any questions.
Okay.
I'm keeping an eye on the chat box, but nothing so far.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. And so I always think it's important to include some information from a veteran's perspective, because I have never served in the military. I am a civilian, so I'm getting all of my information from just speaking with service members and veterans and also from research. But there was a Huffington Post article and a book written about these Marine Corps veterans by journalist David Wood, and he interviewed them asking them about their experiences of moral injury. And this is what they described as moral injury, which I think could be really, really important to consider, not just the research behind it, but also what veterans themselves are saying. And so the first gentleman said that you're praying that the decision you make is the right one. And if it is the wrong one, which a couple of decisions were the wrong ones, you're paying the price and you are living with it. And then Mr. Stephen Canty, he actually created a really great documentary that's on Amazon, Amazon Prime if you have it right now, but about his experiences. It's called Once a Marine if anybody's interested. But what he had said about moral injury is he stated, you learn to kill and you kill people. And it's like, I don't care. I've seen people get shot. I've seen little kids get shot. Once you're able to do that, what's morally right anymore? How good is your value system if you train people to kill another human being, the one thing that we're taught not to do? Your morals start to degrade. And so you can kind of see from somebody who's experienced that, their perspective and how profound of an impact this can have. All right. Okay, so on this slide, I just outlined, this is Jinkerson and colleagues. Again, they had proposed this symptomatic definition. And I guess their argument for why this is important, and aspects of it I agree and aspects I don't, because again, I think a lot of post-trauma symptoms are very natural responses to trauma that people have experienced. But there are some potential benefits for having a diagnosis related to moral injury. And kind of their argument was twofold. One is for insurance and billing. If you can't diagnose something, then it can be really hard to bill for that and find treatments. But a huge one is related to service connection and people getting benefits that they deserve from the military service. So I have worked with people that have experienced a potentially morally injurious event during their service, and they present with some of these symptoms that are really, really impactful to their life, but they don't meet full criteria for that PTSD that we talked about. And so when that happens, then I've had people that have gotten denied a service connection claim, even though they have this trauma that's significantly impacting their life because they don't quite meet that criteria. So that's one of the arguments of why, as providers and as a system, we need to be looking at moral injury even more closely. And so what they proposed is that to meet criteria, an individual would need to present with exposure to a potentially morally injurious event, some of those examples we talked, and then experience guilt, which is kind of the core of symptoms that we see. And then also two of these other symptoms, right? So shame, spiritual conflict, including subjective loss of meaning in life, loss of trust in others, or transcendental ultimate being. So whatever it is that you consider spiritual, feeling a loss of trust in that. And then also we see depression, anxiety, anger, re-experiencing symptoms. So that's things like nightmares, flashbacks, self-harm, and social difficulties as well.
And Dr. Sigler, we do have a question. Did you want me to? Okay.
Sure.
So Alex had asked, do you feel people of strong faith have a more or less difficult time to to deal with these moral issues?
It's a great question. And I think that it's such a psychologist answer, it depends. And the reason I think it depends is because I think in some ways, if you have a really strong faith or spiritual support system when returning from combat or discharging from the military, that can serve as a protective factor, right? So if you have family members, friends, clergy members that you feel close to and you feel like you can talk to them about this, and we'll talk about that actually a little bit, I think on the next slide or two, that can be a protective factor and help people work through this without ever having to come see a psychologist or be diagnosed with anything. It kind of can provide that support. On the other hand, though, when people do have this really strong value system and really strong morals, which I would argue is 99.9% of all the veterans I've met have that really strong value system, that when things happen that go against that conflict with that, that's kind of what sets up the potential for moral injury to be present. And then can be hard to make meaning of that and understand how that can fit into your moral and value system as you're moving forward. I hope that answered his question somewhat, and we'll be talking about it a little bit more as well. Okay, and this is a little bit, and it's perfect that you asked that question, so thank you so much. A little bit related to that is there is this difference between what the researchers define as moral pain versus moral injury. And they make this distinction again because a lot of these reactions are a very natural response to trauma, right? Like if something horrible has happened or you've been exposed to months and months and months of a deployment where you're experiencing these traumas and witnessing these things, it is very common and natural to have some of these reactions, right? So when they talk about moral pain, these are these painful moral emotions and cognitions, questions you're asking yourself, feelings of guilt or sadness. And we say that this is very expected and natural and it's non-pathological, right? Like we wouldn't diagnose that. It's actually healthy to feel some of those things and try to process and make sense of them. And a lot of times these things are resolved within the community or support group, right? So within the clergy or within your family members, friends, being able to talk about what happened and process with them and get that support from them. A lot of that over time just kind of naturally dissipates, it recovers, you can kind of make sense of it, incorporate that into your identity and use that as a way to grow. But when we think of moral injury, really what it is it's when it goes beyond that, right? And so they define the moral injury as the expanded and additional psychological, social, and spiritual suffering that stems from unhelpful attempts to manage or cope with the experience of moral pain, right? So you're experiencing this moral pain. And then with the moral injury, it's like you're trying to cope with that. You're trying to avoid it, push it away, deal with it. Some people use substances to deal. All of those things can then lead to it becoming moral injury, right? When you don't feel that you have the tools or the support to effectively deal with it. And so this is what we often think of more relating to symptoms of PTSD. And that often requires some intentional intervention, trying to help somebody overcome and move past it.
And Dr. Sigler, we have another question. Would you need me to read that to you now or?
Sure.
Okay, let's see here. So Cindy asked, as a caregiver, how can I help my son continue his therapy? He goes in and out of services. I know he is struggling because of his moods and times of withdrawing, insomnia, and not being able to hold a job.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to hold that one just because we're going to talk a little bit about different treatments and resources. And I think that when I'm talking about that, that'll be a perfect time to answer that question, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, we can get that to that
okay.
When you want, Dr. Sigler.
Perfect. All right, so a little bit about the theory. There's two main theories, that I like related to moral injury, but there's a lot of them out there. So this is definitely, again, not an exhaustive thing since we don't have hours and hours to discuss. But the image here is the cognitive behavioral model of moral injury. And basically what these researchers are proposing is that individuals have a predisposition for developing some symptoms related to trauma. So these can be genetic factors, family history, if somebody has a history of abuse or childhood trauma, how cognitively flexible they are, so kind of how they're able to incorporate new information and change their way of thinking, and then their initial ability to regulate their emotions. So that's kind of all things that you don't really have control over. Those are just things that either it was ingrained in you from birth or that happened during your life. And those aren't necessarily things that we would change. But a lot of times people can experience all of those things and then not develop PTSD or moral injury. But if they have this activating event, so that could be, again, taking a life, failing to prevent something from happening, witnessing trauma, feeling that betrayal. If one of those events happen, it kind of activates these predisposing factors. And all of that kind of collects together to lead to some of these acute symptoms. So symptoms that people are experiencing currently in the moment. And those can be cognitive, behavioral, physical, or emotional things. And there's some examples there of like thoughts like I'm worthless, or avoidance, social withdrawal, feeling insomnia, agitation. Chronic pain is very, very common in individuals experiencing this, and also feelings of guilt, shame, and anhedonia, which is basically like not wanting to do anything, kind of feeling that numb feeling. Next slide, please. And this next one is the adaptive disclosure theory of moral injury. Has a similar vibe, but they discuss it in a little bit different way. And so what Litz and colleagues say is basically, and similar to what we're talking about with those morals and values that somebody develops, right, is that we all have some sense of morals and values that are important from us, whether it's from our childhood, from our parents, from teachers, from the military, from friends that we grew up with, whatever it is. For everybody, it's probably a little bit different, right? But we have this sense of moral worth. And in the theory of moral injury, what they say is there's some event that happens that conflicts with that, right? You have an idea of how the world should be, how you should behave, what should happen. And there's an event that kind of shatters those beliefs. And this can lead to this thing that we call cognitive dissonance. But basically what that is when people are having some type of internal conflict or internal struggle, right? So you have your values and your morals, you have this event, and you're trying to make sense of, how does this fit in to how I thought the world was? How does this fit into how I thought I was? And that internal struggle, that conflict, can then lead to that moral injury that we're talking about. And so what we often see is that there's these stable internal negative attributions. So that's like self-blame type thoughts that are pretty stable, right? Like over time, those aren't changing. You're continuing to blame yourself over time. Long-lasting shame and guilt, fear of being judged. And that can be fear of being judged from friends, family members, or a spiritual, whatever it is that you consider spiritual, or a religious leader. Social withdrawal, which you can see, like if people are afraid of being judged, that they might pull away, they might not put themselves in those type of situations. And then finally, this idea of self-condemnation, which is really if somebody gets to the point that they feel like, what is the point? I'm not going to be forgiven. I'm a bad person. There's no coming back from it. And what we see is that those type of symptoms kind of cycle through, right? So if you get to a point that you're really isolated and you're feeling like there's no point, you're going to have even more negative thoughts about yourself, more shame and guilt, which leads to more withdrawal. And when we're doing treatment, what we're trying to do is like break this cycle in any way possible, depending where the person is. If there's any way that we can help them feel more connected, challenge some of those negative thoughts, work through the shame and guilt, right? All of those areas we're trying to, at any point in the cycle, break that up so that they can start feeling some recovery from that. And I think if you click, that other little thing comes up. I was doing a moral injury group when I was at the Memphis VA, and one of the veterans there, I was explaining this theory and going through it in the group, and one of the veterans said that he really identified moral injury as a sense of loss, right? He said like a loss of myself and who I am, a loss of my relationships, but also a loss of my connection with my spirituality and what I feel is important in that realm. And so I think it just, when people go through this cycle, it can lead to really those feelings of loss. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we think about this idea of, is moral injury PTSD? Is it different from PTSD? How are they the same? How are they different? I think just my personal opinion, that it's important that it's viewed as at least something above and beyond life threat type PTSD, right? Because we know from research that there's a lot of differences, and also that treatment can look very different. And so the National Center for PTSD, just in 2019, actually just acknowledge that these things are different, right? That it's a different construct than just simply PTSD. And so what they said was PTSD is a mental disorder that requires a diagnosis. Moral injury is a dimensional problem. There's no threshold for the presence of moral injury, but rather at any point in time, a veteran may have none to mild to extreme manifestations. And what they really emphasized was that transgression, so this is like either witnessing somebody doing something wrong that you don't agree with, or doing something yourself that's against your morals and values. So they're saying transgression is not necessary to develop PTSD, nor does the PTSD diagnosis fully capture what moral injury can be. And so what they recommend is basically for us providers that we really need to talk about this topic and assess and figure out what type of trauma somebody's experienced, if not multiple of those, because many people experience across all domains, and what's really the presenting concern, and use that while we're making treatment recommendations. Next slide. This is just like a visual representation of PTSD moral injury. There's some different symptoms that are commonly associated with PTSD, like those more anxiety type ones, having that startle reflex, that fight or flight, or having flashbacks. Moral injury, they commonly see sorrow, grief, self-condemnation, shame, and alienation. But then is a whole lot of overlap between those two, right? So we're not saying they're completely different constructs, but they're basically different types of reactions to trauma. So guilt, anger, depression, insomnia, nightmares, self-medication are all very common across both of those. Next slide. This is one of my favorite slides, although I won't go too much in depth because it gets confusing for me even. But I thought it was a really interesting study that was done in 2019. When what they did is they did fMRI scans, which is a brain scan that looks at the activation in the brain. And they looked across people that had experienced different types of trauma. So they looked at combat-related and sexual and physical abuse, as well as this moral injury based trauma, to see is there actual differences in how the brain is reacting to these events. And what they found is yes, there is. So when we think of like, is this a different construct? Is it a different concept? Even though it's very interrelated, even the brain, like on that level, like you're not intentionally doing that, but your brain is reacting in a different way. And so what they found was that with the life threat or sexual physical abuse, the amygdala is a part of the brain that's responsible for that fight or flight response. That's what was mostly activated, right? So again, that fear response was activated. But with moral injury, the precuneus, which is a part of the brain that's responsible for recalling memories, kind of pulling those memories from your long-term storage, and also helps us integrate memories, that part of the brain was activated. So the kind of meaning-making part of the brain that's trying to take these memories, integrate them into what we know about the world, was the part that was activated, but only with moral injury type trauma, not with life threat type trauma. So even at the neurological levels, there are differences in these concepts. Okay. So this is another question. Again, we don't have necessarily a specific definition of moral injury. So when you're trying to figure out how common is it that people are experiencing these symptoms related to moral injury, it's a really hard question to answer because lots of studies define it differently. And if they're defining it differently, then we can't necessarily compare across studies. But what we have seen, this graph here is based on a study that was done where they interviewed both paratroopers and Marine Corps veterans that had been involved in the OIF, the Iraq deployment. And this was in the year 2006. And so it asked just about exposure to morally damaging events. So again, we don't know the symptoms they're experiencing after, but how common is it that our service members and our veterans have been exposed to these things? And unfortunately, it's very, very common, right? So when you look at killing an enemy combatant, 48% of paratroopers, 65% of Marines reported that they had experienced that during their deployment. And this is just folks for one deployment. We're responsible for the death of a non-combatant, 14% of paratroopers, 28% of Marines. Handled or uncovered human remains was 50% of paratroopers, 57% of Marines. Saw ill or injured women or children who you're unable to help, huge numbers there. And then had a buddy that was shot nearby, almost a quarter of everybody. So when you look at just across one deployment, the types of things that folks are experiencing, we can see that this is why we have to have summits like this and talks like this to increase the awareness and try to help people manage all these things that they've gone through. For the next slide, I think I just said, like, is this accurate, right? So that's all those people, and that's just one study that was done. There's different studies that show from 50 to 75% of people during a combat-related deployment experience these potentially morally injurious events. But really, it's really hard, not only because the definition of moral injury is not completely consistent, but also when you think about the studies or even at a VA clinic, we're only talking to the people that are willing to come in and talk to us, right? There can be so many other service members and veterans that aren't ready to have help, or they don't know how to reach out for help. And so we know that of all of the eligible veterans for VA care, only about 50% come in and take advantage of that VA care. So these numbers could be lower, but they also could be much, much higher. And so that's just something that we need to keep in mind, is that there could be people that we're not even able to reach yet that are experiencing some of these things. Okay, so I just wanted to touch a little bit on the common comorbidities, and that basically means that when there's other mental health concerns or other things that are occurring at the same time as PTSD or moral injury, right? So they're occurring kind of together. And I think this is important because it's very, very rare that somebody comes into my office and is interested in therapy and they just have this one specific thing they need to work on. Because trauma can have such a wide-reaching impact on our lives, it's typically not just one thing. It's that we're trying to manage all of these things, or many of these things that are happening. And so research shows that as many as 47% of veterans that have a substance use disorder diagnosis also meet criteria for PTSD. And PTSD increases the likelihood of somebody having use substances by at least 4 times, right? So they're 4 times more likely to use substances. And this makes sense when we think of kind of that self-medication hypothesis, right? Of like, if you're trying to figure out, how do I deal with all this? I don't have the support I need. I don't know how I can manage. Often alcohol or substances can be a way that people can kind of numb or try to manage those symptoms they're experiencing. 50% of those with PTSD will also meet criteria for major depressive disorder. And then for traumatic brain injury, this is one of the signature wounds of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. At least 25% of all of the people that were deployed to those conflicts reported history of at least one mild traumatic brain injury. What we see is that if somebody's had exposure to traumatic brain injury, then they're 2 to 3 times more likely to meet criteria for a trauma-related disorder. There's a recent study, and we'll talk a little bit more on this on the next slide, but looking at suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation. It said that of veterans with a PTSD diagnosis, at least 25% report having suicidal thoughts just within the past year. And so it's very common and a higher risk when they're experiencing these things. And then chronic pain, they said that 80% of those with a diagnosis of PTSD also experience chronic pain. It's extremely high that people are experiencing this pain as well as the trauma-related symptoms. And then also just when we're not thinking of diagnoses necessarily, but reduced quality of life, unemployment, difficulties at home and work, relationship difficulties, all of those things are very, very common when somebody's experiencing moral injury. Okay. And so this is a question I get asked often, and I think it's a little sombering and also really important, especially for the individual with the question of, how do I help my loved one trying to go through all this? And so, like, does trauma exposure increase suicide risk? And for a while, there was some studies that were contradictory, right? Some said, oh no, like there's no increased risk, like as long as they have support. Like there's these studies that they just really couldn't like nail down what the risk was. But as we did more and more research, what they see is that it does. The simple answer is yes. But there's just a couple things of how it impacts suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts or death by suicide that are important to note. And so we know that childhood sexual abuse, military sexual trauma, and combat trauma can all increase risk for suicide. However, the intensity and length of trauma can further contribute to risk. So we see the highest risk in the individuals that have had a lot of deployments, a very intense deployment, and a long length of deployment, right? So if somebody has a single incident trauma where they had one event happen and it's impacting them, they're going to be at less risk than somebody that had 6 deployments for 12 months each time. We do know, though, that between the years of 2001 and 2008, suicide rates across branches of the military, across all branches, rose by 50%. And by 2016, the suicide rate was 21.1 per 100,000. And what we've seen from 2001 all the way up to 2016 is it was increasing. And it wasn't until 2016, I think, hopefully due to a lot of VA efforts and increased awareness, that we saw those numbers start decreasing, but they're still much, much higher than they should be. Research also shows that even veterans with sub-threshold PTSD, so they don't even meet full criteria, they just have some of those symptoms that we described, were 3 times more likely to report suicidal thoughts. And then related to moral injury, and this is, again, there's kind of those intricate things that increase risk, is what it's shown is that self-transgression, so that's when people feel like they did something wrong or something that was not in line with their values, as well as guilt and shame, was the highest factor to relate to suicide attempt, even when you're controlling for depression, PTSD diagnosis, and age. And so the moral injury aspect is so important to consider for providers and loved ones, caregivers. And then also when we talk about those things that can occur congruently with trauma, so things like depression, TBI, chronic pain, all of those things further increase risk. So it's a very, very important thing that we need to be raising awareness of and working on through treatment and getting people connected to resources. Before we get into just talking about some of the available treatments and resources, was there any other questions that had come up just about the topic of moral injury?
Yeah, Dr. Sigler, the only question that I wasn't sure if you had addressed it completely, the question that came from Cindy earlier, about the caregiver question. I don't know.
Yes.
Want me to repeat?
Okay. Yeah, and so I think like right now and as we go through this section is going to be a perfect time to answer your questions. And thank you so much for bringing it and for being here and learning more about this to help your son, because I imagine it can be so difficult to try to connect somebody with resources. I think there's a couple things, and we're going to talk about some of the most effective treatments for trauma and moral injury as we go through. But a couple of the things that are really important that seem maybe like common sense, but I think people don't necessarily realize when we're looking at how effective trauma-focused treatment is, really there's 3 things across the board that can be indicative of successful treatment. And it's not which type of treatment you choose, right? Because I'm about to talk about the evidence behind all these treatments. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing that we see consistently through research, number 1, is does the person have good social support, right? So if the therapist is the only support person, it's going to be much less likely for them to have success. So even the fact that you're asking the question, to me, means your son has some support, and that's a wonderful thing because that's going to increase his likelihood that he's going to be successful in treatment. The second one is having a good relationship with the therapist, right? And I hope that all therapists out there, anybody on the summit today, would say that you need to find a good fit, right? You need to have somebody that you feel comfortable with. And if you don't, it's okay to change to somebody else. Because until you find that relationship that you really feel comfortable, and we'll talk about this a little bit as we go through this, if you're not comfortable, you're not going to talk about the things that are like most private that you've been avoiding, and that's the most painful parts of what you've been through. You're just not going to be willing to share that if you don't feel comfortable with a provider. And then the third piece of it is finding the treatment that is the best fit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these different treatments that are available, but really it's most important that the veteran or service member finds one they identify with that makes sense to them and that they believe is going to help them. And that's what's most likely to keep them coming back into treatment, right? They can't be fit into like a little box of treatment of, oh, this works, this works, this works. They have to be part of collaborating on that treatment plan. And I hope as we go through, you'll get some more answers to that as well.
Okay, thank you for answering that, Dr. Sigler. I don't see any other questions in there, so please continue.
Okay. And so this slide here, there's been a lot of questions about, so there are some like traditional PTSD treatments that we call a trauma-focused evidence-based treatment for PTSD, which means that it's focused on trauma and that it has research indicating it's helpful for most people most of the time. Right? There's not a guarantee, but we have some treatments that we know are most likely to be effective. The question that comes up a lot is this sufficient to help with moral injury? And the National Center for PTSD just says it may not be sufficient. But there's a whole bunch of researchers out there looking at what are the different treatments that might be helpful. So if you'll go to the next slide. This first one talks about basically of the treatments that are already on like the VA, Department of Defense, and American Psychological Association kind of best practice guidelines. Like these are the things that we know are most helpful. Of those treatments, the top 3 that they found research that can be helpful for moral injury is prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. So prolonged exposure is a treatment that's approximately 8 to 15 sessions. And this is just going to be like a whirlwind overview of these treatments, just so you can kind of get a feel for them and hopefully follow up, whether if you have questions with myself or with a provider about these. But prolonged exposure is typically 8 to 15 sessions for 90 minutes once a week. And really what it's looking at, it's a cognitive behavioral therapy that focuses on the role that avoidance plays in maintenance of PTSD or trauma symptoms, right? So when we think of avoidance, it's very, very common. That was some of the symptoms when we talked about post-traumatic stress. It's very common for people to avoid internal information, so thoughts, memories, feelings, as well as external people, places, and things. They avoid because it's really painful not to avoid, right? So short term, it helps to avoid. You just leave the situation, or you distract yourself, or you use substances. And in the moment, that seems to work. It seems to help numb that out. But what we know is that over time, avoidance is like the number one thing that's going to maintain symptoms, because the symptoms are still there, the impact's still there under the surface. You're just pushing it down. And so what prolonged exposure aims to do is, through collaboration with your provider, in a very gradual way, is find situations, whether it's externally, what we call in vivo exposure in real life, say going to a store or calling a friend from the military you haven't talked to for a long time, or imaginal exposure, just exposing yourself to the memory itself, talking through details and processing with your therapist. That aims to kind of challenge that avoidance so that folks can really take back what's been missing from their life, or what they haven't been willing or able to do because of their trauma-related symptoms. Cognitive processing therapy is typically 12 sessions for 60 minutes per week. There can also be done via group. And what this is, again, a cognitive behavioral therapy, but it really looks at the relationship between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors, and the impact that trauma can have on our views of ourselves, other people in the world. And it specifically looks at some specific domains that are commonly impacted by trauma, including cognitive processing including safety, trust, power and control, esteem, and intimacy, are kind of those 5 domains that cognitive processing therapy looks at. And the goal is really to help people understand, be aware of unhelpful thoughts that might be coming up, and learn skills to be able to challenge and change those unhelpful thoughts. And then acceptance and commitment therapy is more flexible. It's not like as like 12 sessions for 60 minutes, a little more flexible depending on the provider. But it's based in the idea that suffering does not come from the painful emotions themselves, but suffering rather comes from our attempts to manage and control and avoid that suffering. So what it's trying to do is to help people be more present focused, mindful, kind of in the moment, and willing to experience and go through some of these really painful emotions in order to be able to process them, understand their thoughts and feelings, be aware of them, and basically have that acceptance of, this is what's going on, this is what's happened in my past, and I can sit with that without having to try to avoid and push things away. And so what research shows is for prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy probably have the most research. And they show that people that successfully complete, so that they go through the whole treatment protocol, will approximately 60% of those people will no longer meet criteria for PTSD. But I think that there's much more people that, even if they still meet criteria, they're learning skills to better manage those symptoms in order to live a fulfilling and happy life. Um,
Just a quick reminder, Dr. Sigler, we're about 10 minutes away from the end of the session. I'm just going to put some reminders in the chat box with the closing session survey link and the general session survey. So just giving you a heads up about that.
okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Next slide.
Yes, please. Thank
Okay.
you. All right. And so these three treatments are what we consider our moral injury specific psychotherapy. So all of these three treatments, adaptive disclosure, impact of killing, and building spiritual strength, are all treatments that have been specifically designed to help with moral injury, right? Where the other ones were designed as a PTSD treatment that they've shown can be helpful for moral injury. These ones specifically have focused on moral injury. And so adaptive disclosure is a treatment that really focuses on kind of fostering military culture and understanding military culture and how that can develop one's morals and values, while looking at the specific impact of traumatic loss and potentially morally injurious events. And this treatment is 8 or more, so it's designed to be a minimum of 8 sessions individually for 90 minutes with a provider. And what it really looks at is trying to process and understand those feelings of guilt and shame, as well as the idea of making amends. So how can I improve my life moving forward, do things that are meaningful and helpful to myself and my community and my family. And then as well, what it really, I guess, kind of the underlying emphasis, which I really like about it, is trying to almost draw a line around those morally injurious events, right? Like this happened in my life. I understand that, I can accept that. And I feel pain associated with that. However, that is not definitive of who I am as a person, right? Like I am not bad. I'm not defined by that event that happened. And then the impact of killing. This is a very specific treatment for people that have moral injury related to whether it was killing combatants or non-combatants in combat. And it's really designed to be, they recommend that it's done after somebody's already completed either prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy. So it's like an add-on treatment, but it's really done typically individually for 10 sessions for 90 minutes a session. And it really looks at the natural response that people can have after experiencing an event in which they took a life, and understanding the physiological response of killing, as well as cognitions that can come along with killing. And really helping people understand the impact of that and how that's impacted their life and how they can kind of make sense of that and move forward after an event like this happened. And then building spiritual strength is a group psychotherapy that actually started at the Minneapolis VA, which is typically 8 to 10 sessions for 2 hours each. And it's actually co-facilitated by a mental health professional and a chaplain. And what they try to do is to help build upon somebody's already kind of their foundation, their spiritual foundation, and understand the impact that trauma can have on their spirituality and how to move forward through self-forgiveness and making amends in order to rebuild that spiritual connection. Next slide, please.
We had a quick comment and addition, Dr. Sigler. So that Cindy just mentioned she feels like her support is making him withdraw even more for her son. And she just needs to understand where to back off and when to, for lack of a better word, push him in to keep his appointments, and had just mentioned the old adage where you can lead a horse to water.
Absolutely. Yeah,
and
that can be such a hard balance.
Finding that balance. And real quick, I'll just add the question from another participant. Jackie said, are you aware of any place we can get training on these therapies?
So when we think of like VA training, I think of like how PE and CPT have those like rollouts where they have the consultation. For all of the moral injury based treatments, those don't exist yet. But there is, like, on the National Center for PTSD CEU website, there's a training about adaptive disclosure. They also have their treatment manual available. And there is a treatment manual available for the building spiritual strength. The impact of killing is actually such a new treatment that they haven't released the manual yet. So it's kind of in the new processes of being researched. And there's lots of studies about it, but I haven't found anywhere that you can actually get the training for that one. But they're doing it. We just need to have access to it, hopefully soon.
I don't know if they have that type of training, Dr. Sigler, on Psych Armor website. I don't know. I haven't seen that on there, but I was just curious maybe if you had seen that on there or not.
I had not.
Okay.
But yeah, there's also on the, I can't remember the exact website, but it's like the deployment psychology website. They often have trainings about moral injury, and adaptive disclosure is kind of the big one they're doing more training on.
Okay.
Okay, I know we just have a few minutes, so and I wanted to save a little time in case there's other questions that are coming up, but I wanted to make a point just about community and spiritual support. Most of what I've been talking about is kind of the clinical aspects of things coming into a mental health professional and seeking treatment. But what we know is that they say that approximately 25% of all veterans and service members first talk to a clergy member to seek support and help and mental health support before ever coming to a VA provider or a community mental health provider. And so that's a huge amount of people that kind of the frontline mental health responders are the clergy. And research shows that the community and spiritual and social support can be really, really important in healing from moral injury. I think about it as trying to be like a community wraparound to help individuals experiencing that if we could get them support from all these different areas, it's just going to set them up for the best success. And then many of you probably know, but many VAs, I'm assuming all VAs, but I don't want to speak for every VA out there, have chaplains available for your support. So if you want to speak to somebody, you just have to let a provider know and they can connect you with that chaplain as well.
Did you want to take any time to, I'll be sending everyone back to the general session for the closing remarks, Dr. Sigler, in about a minute or two. So if you wanted to complete some of the slides or take any questions, it's up to you.
If you'll just go just to the next slide quick, just so people can see it. There are some potential barriers we talked about. I'll just say that, and we talked a little bit with that question, was that people are anxious to talk about moral injury. Some people have never even heard of what moral injury is. And then they have concerns about treatment being effective. And that was kind of the primary concerns that veterans reported having about moral injury treatment. Then if you'll go to the next slide, I think it's where it just says, can treatment, we could skip this one. That's just a quote from a veteran that said treatment worked for him. It was great. Take home messages is a good place. Is basically that moral injury is not an official diagnosis, but it's really an important thing and it can have a huge impact. And I just encourage anybody to advocate for mental health care that fits best for them and find a provider that they feel comfortable with, because it's such a sensitive topic to talk about and can be really challenging. So we just encourage you to try to advocate for what you need, because everybody's an expert on themselves more than we are. So, and then if there's any specific questions, if we have one more minute, if not, that's
okay. Yeah, no, I didn't see any other questions in the chat box. So that's amazing information. And I shared with Dr. Sigler my background as a combat veteran. So I appreciate that information. It hits very close to home. And I know that's helped me during this session. So I'm hoping that helped everybody else as well. Just a quick little reminder that these sessions are being recorded, everybody. So everyone that attends will receive an email from Eventbrite where you signed up when the recordings have been uploaded. So you can take a view, you can look at the session that you sat in or any other session that you did not participate in. And if anyone has any other questions, let's see here. Oh, okay, we did get a question from Point Man saying Point Man is a faith-based vet peer support group that deals with, let's see, it's MI and PTS.
so moral injury and post-traumatic stress.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't know about that resource. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, and if you have any information from Point Man, like if you have a website or something, please feel free to share it in the chat box. That's what I love about these events. We can network and we're stronger together, the strength in numbers. So that's why I like to attend these personally. And he did put the Gmail, the point of contact in there. I don't see anything else, Dr. Sigler. So again, if you didn't have anything else you wanted to share, we appreciate you being here. We appreciate your time and your expertise. I know I'm looking forward to visiting you up there in Prescott as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys all for coming. And I don't know if you click on the next slide, there's like just some contact information for National Center for PTSD, Veterans Crisis Line information, and also whether myself or somebody else, if depending where you are, in Arizona is if you have any questions about treatment or anything, please feel free to contact your local PTSD clinical team. We're always more than thrilled to talk to somebody and tell them how to go through the process of getting a referral for treatment. So the number and everything's going to be different depending on where you're located. But you could definitely call the VA and just ask to talk to the PTSD team, and they can hook you up with a provider that can answer any questions that you have.